So we've heard about the horror of the Benin Punitive Expedition. We know about the looting that took place in February 1897. And you may be aware of the first auctions that took place in the UK on May of that same year to supposedly cover the costs of the expedition. But how much do we know about what happened after? About what's happened to Benin Bronzes in recent history? Barnaby Phillips, a former Africa correspondent at the BBC and Al Jazeera, has covered major stories such as the AIDS epidemic, the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, and the wars in Liberia. In April of this year, the deeply researched Loot, Britain in the Benin Bronzes, was published. In it, Barnaby takes us on a journey. The book describes the collision between the British Empire and the Benin Empire and everything that flowed from it. Leveraging his journalistic and investigative experiences, Barnaby uncovers the distribution of the bronzes amongst the world's great museums and private collections. The book also explores today's debate over the future of these bronzes. So in this talk, Barnaby will reveal the people of today's Benin City, the private market for Benin bronzes, the reality of the British Museum and the National Museums of Nigeria, and he probes the lessons that we must learn if restitution is to succeed. Barnaby's value in this debate is as an observer and a commentator, not as a campaigner for the restitution of Benin bronzes. And so, in my best radio voice, Barnaby, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adenike, and thank you everyone who's joined us today. As Adenike said, a lot has been said about Benin Bronzes in recent times, all over the world. And so we've tried to look for some angles, some new angles to this discussion. I hope there are many such new angles in my book. Obviously, I'm aware that the audience we've got today is coming with different expertise from different parts of the world with different perspectives. So apologies in advance if some of this is well known to you, very obvious. There may be other people for whom it's not, but I hope there'll be something new for everybody. And starting, as Adenike said, with Benin City today. And what is the connection between the city the British looted, the capital of the old Edo Empire, and that modern city in Nigeria? Well, I think what's important to say here is that although 1897 was a catastrophe for Edo culture, it certainly wasn't the end of it. In fact, any visitor to Benin City today comes away with a very strong feeling of just how intact that culture is. The venerated Oba still in his palace, which stands on the same grounds as the palace which the British looted in 1897. He is, of course, the great-great-grandson of Oba Omordamwen, who was forced into exile when the British invaded. The complex hierarchy of chiefs, the great calendar of festivals, all of that is still there. So too, of course, are the brass custers of Egon Street, just a short distance away from the palace. Unlike in the past, they're trying to sell their products on the open market. They're not working exclusively for the Oba as they did in the past. And I suppose the results of what they're trying to do these days can sometimes appear a little bit garish, you might say. This is an enormous brass tusk, which I found being made on Egon Street in 2019, perhaps commissioned by a wealthy person, a hotel, a business, who knows. You'll find that sometimes people are a little bit harsh about what is produced on Egon Street these days. They'll call this tourist art. One well-known American observer of Benin City said, it's a bit like Tijuana. But I think the important point to make is that the craftsmen are using the exact same lost wax method, the exact same laborious and exacting method in the same place where their ancestors have done for hundreds of years. Egon Street is not a World Heritage Site, despite what everyone in Benin City will tell you. In fact, and despite the sign at the end of it, I assumed it was. I checked with UNESCO, I couldn't find it on their website, and I ended up having to speak to the UNESCO spokesperson in Paris who said it definitely is not a site, but maybe it should be. The tradition is very much alive. And so sometimes we talk about the Benin Bronzes as if they were, objects that, their creation stopped in 1897. Nothing could be further from the truth. And indeed, for all the criticisms of so-called tourist art, there are master craftsmen still doing their work in Benin City today. This is a man, Phil Omordamwen, who I think is regarded by many, his family foundry, as one of the finest, one of the most respected. He works to commission, often for clients abroad. In fact, you can see there, Hartwig Fischer, the director of the British Museum, visited him in 2018. And this is something I talk about in my book. There was a discussion over whether he could make a contemporary brass piece for the British Museum, showing migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean. I think there was a little bit of a misunderstanding about this request. I wouldn't want to make too much of it, but Phil, some of whose family have reached Europe indeed in that perilous way, felt that it was initially something that he didn't want to do, and then later he felt that perhaps he would. In any case, hopefully one day Phil Omordamwen's wonderful work will be shown in the British Museum and to other international audiences. But he is already very much in touch with private dealers and with customers all over the world indeed. So what are people in Benin City saying about restitution and 1897? Well, when Mark Walker, he is the grandson of Captain Herbert Walker, who was part of the British expedition in 1897. You might recall he took the personal initiative to return 2 Benin Bronzes there in 2014. He received a hero's welcome. I think it's fair to say that the idea of restitution is very popular, but it's also not, I don't think, necessarily at the top of the list of most people's concerns, who are, of course, often worried about more bread and butter issues, you might call them: roads, schools, hospitals, jobs, and so on. And I'd say perhaps particularly within the cultural elite, you meet quite a range of dissenting voices. In Lute, I quote Ekagusa Essien. He's a 90-year-old, very respected doctor and Edo historian. And he says one of the good things about 1897 is that our bronzes were taken away and looked after. Now that's untypical, but I would say that his concern that we wouldn't have looked after them as well, that they'll get stolen if they come back and so on, you'll hear that quite a lot, and maybe to a surprising degree. And I'm sorry to say, one impression I did have, a tangible piece of evidence, I suppose, that you might say backs up some of these concerns, is the very sad state of Benin City's magnificent earth walls and moats. They are Nigerian national monuments, but this doesn't seem to offer them much protection at all. In places, the moat is a sewer, it's covered in rubbish, people dig away at the earth walls for building material. In fairness, that is a source of shame and concern to many people in Benin City. And it's bewildering, I suppose, in some ways, given the pride and tradition, custom, language. But that's Benin City today. Now let's talk about the impact on the private market over the very charged debate about restitution. I'm aware that there may be people watching this who know more about the private market than me, but I'll give it a go based on my research. And just to put it in context for others, thousands of Benin Bronzes were looted, thousands are in museums, but many hundreds at least, including, I would say, many of the absolute finest Benin Bronzes are in private collections, in particular across the Western world. And as Adenike said, that process began in May of 1897, immediately after the soldiers and sailors of the Benin expedition had returned home, when the first auction began and objects began to filter through the private market. Here you see a famous sale of a Benin bronze head from 1989, which I write about in my book. And coming up, you can see a little bit of the history of this bronze, which is so typical. Privately owned, popping up at auction, disappearing back into the shadows, as it were, returning to auction, And now look, it's in the Musée de Quai Branly. And in Loot, I try and trace this and other similar histories, and wherever I can, link back famous, iconic Benin Bronzes to the specific British officers who took them, or if you prefer, stole them in 1897. But I do think things have changed a little bit in how Benin Bronzes are bought and sold from 1989, especially in the past 5 years or so. For example, we saw last month an auction house in a little town here in England called Battle in Sussex hurriedly withdrew the sale of some Benin Bronzes. Two of them it had advertised as 17th century, and it ended up being skewered, I think, by a logic it could not escape, that if they really were 17th century, well, then they were taken in 1897 almost certainly, in which case these days there is a moral opprobrium, an ethical problem with them, or if they're not, they're forgeries, and you can't escape that logic. To my untrained eye, seeing them on the internet, they seem like forgeries, but I spoke to some pretty respected people who thought they may not be forgeries. So is this what we're going to see more and more? Well, last November, a French auction house, Binochet and Gicolo, were trying to sell what it said was a 19th century Oba's head. The estimated price was about 150,000 euros. They wouldn't answer my queries about the provenance of the head. And in the end, no price was published, and I think it may not have been sold. In my book, I quote Giles Pepiat at Bonhams, who says to him, Benin Bronzes are now like rhino horn or ivory. His own press people, his PR people tell him, don't go near them. Too much reputational risk. The world has changed too much. Social media, you name it. He said someone had recently offered him a very good plaque, clear provenance, not a forgery, worth a six-figure sum, but he wouldn't go near it. Now, I know that Bonhams are not as important as, say, Sotheby's or Christie's in the history of the Benin Bronzes, but I think Giles is right in one sense. It does seem to me really difficult to imagine that a high-profile auction of 1897 Benin Bronzes advertised as such will ever occur again. I spoke to Jean Fritz at Sotheby's. She'd had what she called a bad, or maybe I called it a bad experience. I don't want to quote her. I've written bad experience here, trying to sell a high-profile Benin Bronze back in 2010. You might recall this, when Sotheby's had to cancel the sale of the Galway ivory mask, a very famous piece. Well, you can read what she said about that in my book, but she was very cautious about the PR of selling Benin Bronzes in 2020, but she didn't rule it out. And she said she'd just been contacted by a dealer, in fact, who was looking, or a collector rather, who was looking for a Benin Bronze plaque. Well, then you've got Christie's. I spoke to them in the summer of 2020, and they were categorical that they had not sold a Benin Bronze piece linked to 1897 for at least the previous 4 years, and that was a policy. Now, I have to admit, I think there's some disingenuousness here, because the next day, Christie's were auctioning 2 Benin Bronze pieces, at least one of which, a plaque with a fish on it, certainly seemed to be pre-1897. Christie's told me, quotes from our research, we couldn't link it directly to the punitive expedition. I understand the fish did not sell, but I was left with the impression that Christie's wanted it both ways. They wanted to suggest the antiquity of the piece to those for whom it would be an attraction, but not to dig too deep in case they came up for something uncomfortable and there'll be some bad publicity around. Well, here's coming up a very interesting Benin Bronze with a unique history, which I trace in my book, the so-called Swainson horseman, perhaps the first Benin Bronze to arrive in Britain and uniquely not part of the 1897 loot, but given as a gift by Omordamwen to a Liverpool trader, John Swainson, when he visited Benin in 1892 with Henry Galway on that significant visit. To those who know the history, when the Oba signed, or maybe was coerced, co-opted, convinced, tricked, you take your pick, into agreeing a treaty with the British. But this piece was given to Swainson at that time. We know it was in England before the punitive expedition came back, because it was photographed and discussed in the Liverpool newspapers at earlier dates. And I've seen those. Swainson himself died in 1897, and the horseman was passed on to his baby daughter Florence, who never knew her father. She worked for many years in the Liverpool post office. She kept it outside as a doorstep on her porch, a doorstop, I'm sorry, a memento of the father she never knew. It went all green, incidentally, because of the sea breeze coming onto the Wirral. Anyway, her cousin's grandson, an art student, spotted it on the front porch in the 1970s, realized it was unusual. Christie's quickly gathered how valuable it was. They tried to sell it, but it ended up in the Liverpool Museum. So I call it a Benin Bronze with a happier provenance. One man I did speak to a lot in relation to the private market is Lance Entwistle, a fascinating character, a leading dealer in London and Paris, who has been instrumental in many of the most significant sales of Benin Bronzes in recent years. I managed to get him to open up on some of them, but rest assured, I was left with the impression that Lance does have more secrets to tell. I was able to piece together the extraordinary story of this piece, the Oli Head, which had sat almost forgotten in a London bank vault for more than 60 years and was sold in 2016 to an unknown buyer, as I say there, for £10 million, a world record price by far for a Benin bronze, perhaps for any piece of African art. People listening may know whether that is the case. An early Benin bronze head, so-called early, in incredible condition. It belonged to a Jewish family who'd fled the Holocaust. The woman who sold this piece opened up to me about what she said was her moral dilemma. It was a remarkable conversation, which I recount in my book, full of irony and moral complexity. The buyer, we don't know. He's a man and he's European. I know that. And this surely is the way we're going on the private market. Discreet sales with a minimum of publicity. What's unusual about this sale is that I was able to uncover the details. But will prices even in this private top end of the market be affected? Lance Entwistle says not. At the very top end, collectors will always want such magnificent items, he says. They're on strong grounds legally, if not, you might say morally or ethically. But do I think there may be an element of he would say that, wouldn't he? The top end of the art market does have a symbiotic relationship with museums. And if they and their donors are getting queasy, aren't prices going to fall? Lance and some others I've spoken to say no, the private market in Benin Bronzes will just be driven underground and won't be regulated. Well, we'll have to see. Let's move on to museums. In this section, I'm going to talk about the British Museum. That's its famous display of plaques in the Sainsbury Gallery downstairs, and just what a difficult position I think the British Museum is in at the moment in relation to the Benin Bronzes, indeed in relation to many other objects. But I'll come to that in a moment, because first I want to talk about Nigeria's museums, their history of Benin Bronzes and where they are today. And I was determined in my book not to romanticize either the Benin Empire or Nigeria today, but to bring out and discuss some awkward facts. And the story of Nigeria's museums does have some awkward elements to it. And I've sometimes been surprised how little understanding there is in Europe of the issues in Nigeria. And there's a striking difference, I feel, between the debate in Nigeria itself, where the problems of its museums is discussed in a much more candid and nuanced way than it is in Europe, or I would assume in the United States. I was chatting last week to Philip Ianicho, who some of you may know is now a key player in the proposed new museum in Benin City, which I'll come on to later. And he said, Nigeria is not short of great museum pieces. Nigeria is short of great museums. In my book, I write a lot about the man on the right-hand side of the picture here, Kenneth Murray, founder of Nigeria's museums, and a man who in the 1940s and 50s works incredibly hard to bring back some of the finest Benin Bronzes to Nigeria. And he's not just bringing back any old pieces. He's working with Bill Fagg of the British Museum, who many of you will know or have heard of, And in the London auctions, FAG is working as to commission with Kenneth Murray's money from the colonial administration in Nigeria. And that together they acquired dozens of the most spectacular Benin bronzes, like this Queen Idia head. It's similar to the Queen Idia head in the British Museum, or there's one in Berlin, there's one in Liverpool as well. He buys what is considered, I believe, by some people as the finest pair of brass leopards, and what Kenneth Murray thought was the greatest carved tusk of all. All of those pieces belong to Nigeria today. Murray died, sadly, in 1972 in Nigeria, a few days after the cars had switched from driving on the left to the right-hand side. He died in a car crash. He'd lived there since the 1920s. He's a fascinating figure, a flawed, I believe quite an abrasive character, but a brilliant man. And I would say in the tragic history of the Benin Bronzes, he's a hero. And here, coming up, is his National Museum in Lagos. It opened in 1957, and according to the great Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, it has, I quote, an air of exquisite abandon. Most visitors who come today are children on compulsory school trips, but compare this with the excitement of its opening years. Kenneth Murray, I've been through his private letters, wrote in September 1960, and the Nigerians and maybe others will realize that means just a few weeks before Nigeria's independence. The crowds were so great that no one could get in or out. The flowers trampled, the stairs almost broken. The police could not control them. The next day, Kenneth Murray had to get to the top floor with a ladder because the staircase was jammed by crowds. He wrote, there were 30,000 visitors in one day. Well, I'm not quite sure I believe that figure, to be honest, but I don't doubt there were enormous crowds. So what went wrong? Well, by the 1980s, Nigeria's museums are underfunded, morale has dropped, corruption has soared, and the 80s and 90s in particular, I believe, are a notorious time of theft. And some of the objects stolen include Benin bronzes. There's many other problems, public indifference, maybe even a rise in evangelical Christianity with a more suspicious attitude to traditional artifacts and their spiritual value. There's a picture coming up which Adenike took inside the Lagos Museum a few years ago, where only a small proportion of the Benin bronzes it has are actually in display. A British academic and expert on the Benin bronzes, a man called Philip Dark, wrote in 1982, he tried to do something very ambitious and sort of compile a list of Benin bronzes around the world. And he came up with more than 500 in Nigerian museums. That doesn't mean they were all pre-1897. He included some very fine 20th century pieces as well. But he thought in the Lagos National Museum, there is a collection of some 270, I think is his figure. I think most experts, in fairness, would argue that the era of rampant theft in Nigerian museums is over. Security is much better now, but other problems do remain. And so you have this strange situation today where Benin City has a perfectly respectable looking government museum. It opened in the 1970s, and here's its curator, Theophilus Omordamwen. The museum was actually given a big makeover by the Smithsonian. I think it was in 2012, a few years ago, and it looks pretty good inside. But despite all the talk of returning Benin bronzes, European museums have never really considered the idea of giving them back to Theophilus's museum. Not because, I hasten to add, they've got anything against him personally, not at all that, but because of their concerns about the Nigerian National Commission for Museums and Monuments. Of course, they'll be diplomatic about this in public. I can be a little bit more frank about it, but let's just put it this way. The Benin Dialogue Group that brings together the NCMM from Nigeria, the Oba's Palace, the Edo State Government, and some key European museums, its dialogue was going nowhere until 2017, when the Oba's Palace, through Prince Gregory Akenzwa, said, all right, we'll build a royal museum. And by implication, it won't be a Nigerian government museum. And hey presto, that unblocked the logjam. And I think that says it all. It's very, very significant. Well, let's talk now about the British Museum, the most important Western museum, I would say, in the history of the Benin Bronzes, the biggest collection, almost 1,000 with over 100 on display at any one time. And indeed, perhaps the most iconic of all the Benin Bronzes, the beautiful Queen Idia mask. It's on the cover of my book, you know it well. The most exquisite of the 5 masks said to have been looted from Omordamwen's bedroom chamber in February of 1897, and the subject of some uniquely bitter diplomacy between Britain and Nigeria in its own right in the 1970s, as I reveal in my book, going through now unclassified Foreign Office documents, British Museum documents. For many Nigerians, of course, it is the Festac mask with a dual status as both a symbol of colonial and racial injustice and past wrongdoings, but also a symbol of African defiance and cultural achievement, and that is its unique value. When I set out trying to write this book, I thought of the British Museum, as probably a lot of outsiders do, as a very self-confident institution that had no sense of obligation in answering to anyone. By the end, I saw it rather differently, a divided institution. Maybe I've been a bit naive before. I mean, the British Museum is a huge place full of very capable and brilliant people. And of course, they're going to have different ideas about the future and how things should go forward. But I see it as unsure of itself. It has a default position of battering down the hatches and saying nothing, not because it doesn't care, but because it doesn't know what to say. And often it just wants problems to go away. And specifically in relation for the Benin Bronzes, I believe there is a looming car crash with perhaps every other museum in the Benin Dialogue Group, which is a grouping, as I was saying earlier, of major German, British, Dutch, Swedish museums, every other museum ready to give their Benin Bronzes back, and indeed other museums that are not in the Benin Dialogue Group also ready to give their Benin Bronzes back, and the British Museum only being able to loan some back as well. Of course, the British Museum is constrained in a way that none of those other museums are by the 1963 British Museum Act, which makes de-accession very difficult. Now, in the past, museum directors, museum trustees have often been accused of hiding behind this act, but I dare say there are occasions when that accusation has been justified. But the act is a reality. This government would need to change the law. This Conservative government doing that, well, I find that hard to imagine. But there's also a sense that the current leadership of the British Museum lacks the political clout, the nous, the know-how of the corridors of Whitehall, if you like, the will to take the government on, to deal with the government in a way. When I look back to the debate between the British Museum and the British government in the 1970s over the Festac mask, well, what's so striking is that the British Museum essentially tells the Foreign Office to go to hell, that its diplomatic problems are not its problem, and it has no intention of giving back the Festac mask. So in those days, the British Museum would stand up to the government. I think the British Museum feels in a weaker position now. The pandemic, of course, has hurt its revenues very hard and made it feel, I would argue, even more vulnerable to government pressure. In the meantime, the British Museum, in fairness, will do its best to be a constructive partner in the ongoing restitution process. And it has helped raise millions of pounds for the archaeology in Benin City, which is a prelude to the building of the new museum. And that brings us on nicely to the future. And this is one of the people who you might have been heard quote a lot in the media in recent weeks and months, Inoti Ogbegbo, a well-known Benin City artist, an important figure in the negotiations on the future of the bronzes. He's on the board of the Legacy Restoration Trust, which is the grouping that has, the body that has been formed that will be responsible for the new museum, and de facto has sort of become or is fast becoming a one-stop restitution agency. That wasn't the basis on which it was established. Its board includes prominent Edo artists, people like Inoti, Victor Eokamano, who you probably will have heard of as well. But also represented there, you have the 3 important bodies: the Nigerian federal government, the Edo state government, and the Oba's palace. The significance of Inoti is he straddles a few of those worlds. He's very, very close to Governor Godwin Obaseki of Edo State, a crucial figure in this process, but he's conveniently as well the son-in-law of Prince Gregory Akenzwa, the Oba's uncle, and the Oba's representative within the Benin Dialogue Group. And here coming up is an artist's impression of Emoa, the Edo Museum of West African Art, the proposed new museum to which many institutions have indicated their willingness to return their Benin Bronzes. Now, although the museum won't be finished for years, at least 2025, the people behind it, I think, know that they've got a window of opportunity to lay the foundations, as it were. You've got Godwin Obaseki there. You've got Sir David Ajayi, the celebrated Anglo-Ghanaian architect, the man responsible for the Smithsonian Museum of African-American history and a, I suppose, an international superstar in the world of architecture. You've got Philip Ianichu, who I was referring to before, who's actually he's an Igbo from eastern Nigeria, although I think he describes himself as a detribalized Nigerian. I don't think he identifies in that way. Who's a credible international fundraiser, and that's his job. So that's a dream team assembled. But of course, Obaseki is on his second term. He's only there until 2024. So they need to strike while the iron is hot. And when, earlier I was talking about we need to talk more about the Nigerian complexities and understand the Nigerian side more. Well, just imagine if Godwin Obaseki had not been re-elected in the gubernatorial election, which took place in September of last year in Edo State. And for those who follow Nigerian politics, it was extremely closely contested. He fell out with the ruling party. It could have gone the other way. Let's face it, gubernatorial elections in Nigeria can be pretty murky businesses. And I can tell you that if Godwin Obaseki had not been re-elected, a lot of the museum directors and curators within the Benin Dialogue Group would have been dismayed. There would be no Philip Ianicho involved. There would be no Sir David Ajayi involved. And where would restitution be now? So we do have to understand the Nigerian side of what's happening, and we have to understand Nigerian politics. The vision for this new museum is hugely important to make a museum that hugely ambitious, to make a museum that ordinary Nigerians will want to go to, that reconnects people with their culture in a way you might say that the Kenneth Murray colonial model of museum, the NCMM model, has failed to do. It doesn't just, a museum, it can't just entomb the past, but also give space to new creativity. Well, we're going to have to watch the politics. There will be competing agendas, potentially resentful federal government, tensions even in Edo State between the Oba's palace and the governor, jealousies under the surface. But if it's to work, it needs to be divorced from those politics. And that's why the Legacy Restoration Trust Board is made up primarily of independent directors. And Philip Ianicho would argue is in that way ring-fenced, if you like, from the vicissitudes, the unpredictable events of Nigerian politics. I was talking to Philip Ianicho last week. He said something very striking. He said the people who are most skeptical about the return of the objects are Nigerians. The people who are most worried are Nigerians. Of course, he, and I would imagine many people joining us tonight, do want the Benin Bronzes to go back. But there's a sense that they have to get this process right. It can't be done in a hurry. The estimated cost of the museum, up to $150 million. They need to work out how to cover its running costs. That's perhaps a bigger challenge than raising the money for the museum itself. That is their focus at the moment. In fact, they don't actually have much time for endless discussions with individual Western museums who want to hand back their single Benin Bronze or their two Benin Bronzes, and who are more interested in sometimes perhaps in just getting rid of the objects than what happens to them in Nigeria. But my final thought is an optimistic one, is that at least it's up to Nigerians to make it happen. It is in their hands to build a project that, in my opinion, would be the most significant moment in African cultural history since independence. And the fact alone that it is Nigerians who are shaping the future of the Benin Bronzes to a large extent for the first time since 1897, since Admiral Harry Rawson and his men carted them off, Well, that is indicative of how the world has changed. And it's why this is such an exciting time.